go on, but thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of our the HEA's Hydrogen Byte series, which is our lunchtime 30-minute webinar series where we showcase the breadth and depth of our members' expertise. And we're really excited to be joined today by Roadnight Taylor, Kyle Murchie specifically. He's the Specialist Connections Engineer at Roadnight Taylor, and Roadnight Taylor support on electricity grid connection issues, applying their deep expertise in this area and going beyond those conventional generalist approaches. So really excited to have Kyle with us today. For those of you that don't know the HEA, I know many of you are members, but this is a webinar series where we invite the wider network within the hydrogen sector. So I will just share a quick slide on the makeup of the HEA. As we're all aware, we're joined with Roadnight Taylor, but the HEA represents a range of companies right across the whole value chain, from production, transportation, storage, and the use, and then very much a strong voice within the supply chain, professional services as well. And Roadnight Taylor is reflective of that category. So without further ado, I'll pass over the floor to Kyle. Kyle will be delivering a presentation for us today, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask Kyle any questions in the Q&A and the chat function. And a recording will be made available because I know that there's a jam-packed presentation on Kyle's side, and there's lots of insights and information here. So we will be able to circulate these materials in a PDF format and as a recording after the webinar. So over to you, Kyle. Thank you for joining us today.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. So I suppose to kind of set the scene a little bit, I'm kind of here obviously from very much a connections and electricity connections background, more than hydrogen or natural gas, although in a previous life did look at that as well. For really what we are seeing a lot of is change in the energy industry, and particularly around the electricity connections process. A lot of that has been driven by such a long and kind of unwieldy queue of projects looking to connect, and that's been predominantly generation and storage. More so the latter in recent years, particularly since kind of 2017. And if you do get involved at all in anything electrical, then you'll definitely have heard about kind of energy storage and obviously the impact it can have on getting access to new demand capacity as well, given it's obviously needing both demand and generation capacity at grid level. So there's been lots of change going on, and in that change, there's been, I would say, relatively limited impact on new demand, other than kind of barring on new applications for kind of transmission scale demand at this moment in time. There's been a bit of a pause on that. But in terms of kind of wider implications on projects, it's been more muted compared to what generation and storage have seen. However, noting that everything not everything government are talking about at the moment, but it seems like everything that DESNZ and Ofgem are talking about in the world of connections now is very much focused on demand, the demand queue as it is, and what could be to come. Some of that's driven by hydrogen and a hydrogen conversation, upcoming hydrogen strategy that everyone's eagerly awaiting. But it's also driven by AI growth zones, associated with data centers, new housing, etc. So, if I get onto the kind of setting the scene of why grid connections are a core requirement, I think it's pretty obvious if you're an electrolyzer going to be connecting to the grid and the grid-facing electrolysis. Clearly, you need a grid connection. However, what's maybe less obvious is all the projects that might be looking at hydrogen storage, or it might be looking at behind the meter hydrogen and whether that's electrolysis again or storage using hydrogen as a fuel, effectively all those different use cases for hydrogen always tend to come back to some level of grid connection. It might be that that project itself doesn't have to hold the grid connection. That would be a third party that you're connecting through, but it needs to have the connection, and it importantly needs to have the right technology category associated with it. We've moved away from the idea of having, a capacity as a number, as a kind of megawatt or MVA sort of figure, and any technology can effectively sit under it as long as you've got a kind of design envelope of technical requirements. It's now much more a case of, right, we need that still, but we're also going to make sure that certain technologies are limited so that effectively the queue doesn't become too large for any technology type. And that is going to be quite key for hydrogen and where it's placed, irrespective of whether it's connecting at distribution level, so to, let's say, 11 kV network, all the way through to transmission scale 400 kV connected electrolyzers. So just very briefly on where we've been, where we are now, and why the focus was on generation storage to begin with and not demand. It was, if we go back to July 2024, which wasn't that long ago, but feels like a lifetime ago now, you could see that the total contracted generation queue, generation includes storage in this context. So generation and storage is 535 for transmission, 149 for distribution, and that's in gigawatts. So significant scale of queue. Fast forwards a year, that continued to grow at quite an alarming rate. No matter who you were and whether you agreed with the approaches of connection reform or not, everybody did agree that that queue wasn't sustainable. There were lots of projects in there that would obviously never be built out. It was significantly over the requirement of GB. I mean, to put it into context, our peak utilization across GB at any one time has just been over 60 gigawatts. So, and the majority of the time, we're running kind of in the 30s and 40s. So those sorts of numbers are of installed capacity is obviously significantly over and above the need at the moment and the need that's forecasted. But demand was still significant, but 42 gigawatts was notable, but not in the same scale. So it was felt that while some demand would have to come through the process, kind of transmission connected demand, a lot of effort was made to try and minimize the impact on demand projects so that they could continue, and the focus of any reforms was on the top line, the generation storage. But move forward to Q4 2025. This is when the pause came in on new transmission applications, and effectively a lot of the reforms that had been designed over the previous year. The generation queue continued to grow, as I noted, so it helped justify the reasons for bringing in the new reforms. But we also saw the total contracted demand jump up considerably as well, went from about 42 gigawatts to 125 in the course of a year. And that's predominantly driven by quite a few hydrogen electrolyzers, particularly. I know that in SCN transmissions patch, there was over 10 gigawatts worth of electrolyzer applications. And then across GB, predominantly in the south, it was more driven by data center growth. So where have we got to how do we translate this into kind of practical changes that have been proposed? So the first thing to note is we're in a phase of change. As I said, I'll go into a little bit more detail a little later around what changes have been put in place for generation storage. But when we talk about demand reform, this year has seen quite a few consultations now on demand reform or related accelerations of demand. And it all centers around this idea of curate, plan, and connect. So kind of 3 pillars, so to speak, that have been set out by government. The curate is effectively where we are now, trying to first work out how you best manage a demand queue, noting that you can't just apply the rules that were applied to generation and storage. Sometimes having to remind those that are making some of those indecisions likes of Ofgem and DESNZ, that demand doesn't always play in the energy market, and it's quite important to differentiate the two. So we're in that phase at the moment. Then plan, I suppose a lot kind of runs alongside curate to some extent, but this is where we're talking about strategic plans and that bigger picture around what demand do we need and where should it be? Does government step in and say, well, actually, there's a particular area here that we do want demand to grow in? AI growth zones is a good example of that, but this is taking it a little bit further and trying to marry up where you want growth of a particular demand for economic reasons or societal reasons versus grid capacity and grid reasons. So it's marrying those two together. And then correct is the bit that we end up needing to obviously get to at some point, which is correct it and allow those projects to operate. So at the moment, this is kind of showing you just an extract from the Electricity Network Association, and this is a change that's just come into place this month for demand-connected projects. So if you are looking for a connection in England and Wales up to and including 132 kV, so that's the connection voltage, then you'd be going through a DNO route. And in Scotland, if it was up to and including 30 kV, you'd be going through this route. So generally speaking, we're definitely talking under, well, not definitely. There's a bit of a range. There's no kind of correct number, but if you're in the 100 to 200 megawatt sort of range, then that's normally the tipping point between distribution and transmission, depending on where you are in the country. So certainly anything smaller, you'd be going through this process. And importantly, these rules have been brought in for anything greater than 5 MVA or 5 megawatts. And effectively, it's really just to raise the bar. For quite some time, if you've been asking for new demands and getting a connection to the network, it's been relatively straightforward. You've had to put down, a red line boundary, but not much detail in there. What's been asked for now is more detail. So identifying, yes, the red line boundary, but also the proposed location of substations. It should include the necessary detail of what types of demands, where they would be, that type of thing. So we're getting to the level of not necessarily a full kind of formal design, but showing that there is more than an idea and a red line boundary on a bit of paper. It's to try and, as I said, raise that bar. Similarly, raising the bar for kind of land options and agreements, over and above what was required before, which was a letter of authority. So definitely making it a little bit, not necessarily more difficult in many cases, but for more speculative projects, that was the idea, was to try and remove kind of early speculation, which for hydrogen projects can be quite difficult, particularly if a site's choosing between a couple of different locations and can't quite commit to one particular location at any time. If you're then looking for even a relatively small grid connection, then you are asked for a lot more information than you were just a couple of weeks ago. And then moving into the more global changes, which are very much ongoing, various different consultations, but actually what I find is splitting it out into these kind of components maybe a little bit easier. As Olivia said, we'll share these slides because there's quite a bit of information in them, but effectively we've got that strategic demand connections from DESNZ that aim to accelerate grid connections for strategic demand. And we're talking just before the call that in quite a lot of sectors you're hearing that word strategic. So if you're aligned to a hydrogen strategy, for example, then does that make those projects strategic? If you're part of a hard decision, does that then make you strategic? Similarly, if you've got CFD as a generator, LDES cap and floor contracts, at what point do you stop becoming strategic? Similarly, if you're in some locations, you are competing with lots of different types of demands. So it could be new housing demand, it could be new kind of plans for a new electric buses in a particular city or kind of large town. So quite quickly you can be having quite a few competing requirements, and it comes into what is strategic. So there's a lot of focus on that at the moment, and a lot of feedback has been given around how that could potentially look in the future. But it all comes down to trying to reduce the queue of subscription and enabling earlier access. My view here is, yeah, absolutely, some of this will, as it goes through, help make sure that we have a more realistic and achievable queue, but importantly, it doesn't mean that projects can connect ahead of any reinforcement being needed. We are in a situation in GB where the network needs to grow. Ofgem have committed to that with the transmission operators through all their business plans, but that takes time. You can't create new transmission infrastructure overnight. It can take years, if not more than a decade, to complete some of those plans. So it is highlighting here that even if you're planning a project, if you're going to need a grid connection, the idea of getting a grid connection in 2 or 3 years for a transmission connection is just not going to happen. So making sure that's really part of your kind of early concept and kind of design process, or wherever you are now, is something we definitely recommend. The other points I won't go through in quite as much detail, but really they're kind of building on those points, thinking about fairness as well, and that kind of definition. It always used to be first come, first serve in the electricity world, but this kind of concept of equity rather than quality, should we be looking at prioritizing projects for particular reasons, coming back to that strategic concept again. So connecting the dots with existing connection reforms. So just very briefly, if we go on to the next slide, if the best way to read this one is start from the bottom. Its left-hand side at the bottom is transmission, right-hand side is distribution. So on the distribution side, in 2016, there were some, I suppose, not barriers, but certainly checks and balances. So you had to have a letter of authority from a land perspective, and as soon as you got an offer and signed that offer, you entered into a contract with queue management milestones, and that was all there from kind of 2016 onwards. Looking on the left-hand side, actually most of that didn't come in until 2024. So before 2024, you didn't need a letter of authority for onshore projects. You didn't have any queue management milestones, and that's one of the reasons why that queue became so significant. Over 700 gigawatts worth of generation and storage, because once you were in the queue, there was no way to ultimately remove you, even if you openly installed as a project. There was really very little leverage. Some would argue that there was legally, but certainly the TOs and NESO felt that there wasn't enough legal ground, so these milestones were kind of brought in to support that. And everything above it is what we really refer to as connections reform. So the readiness, the needed, and then the protections. Readiness came in first in terms of concepts. This is saying, well, let's raise the bar even further to say, if you're ready, you either need to have land or you have planning, and there's two kind of separate routes for going through that. You don't need to own the land, you don't need to have the land agreement in place, but you need to have an option for that agreement, which does raise the bar quite considerably compared to a letter of authority, for example. Red line boundary, noting that then can't change without it becoming material, and a minimum acreage for a particular technology type. So making sure somebody doesn't just go and put the whole of Wales into an application and then say they'll sort out the land part later. And then the bit above is the CP30 plan alignment, and this is where, coming in from a government level, that plan to say, well, out to 2035, what do we actually need for different technology types, and that then becoming a bit of a limit on a zonal level, and that is split into zones, and then more widely across GB as a total. And the bit above was then brought in, I suppose, kind of shoehorned in relatively late in the day to say, oh, hold on a minute, but we need to have protections because there's a lot of projects there that don't fit, or wouldn't meet particular criteria for various different reasons. And also, if you're introducing this retrospectively, it's very difficult to maintain investment in these GB projects. So protections were brought in to try and minimise that, particularly projects that are, we're connecting before the end of 2027. So that's where reform kind of got to, and what I'm highlighting here is effectively what we're suggesting is, as part of demand reform, something similar, maybe not to the same extent and not to the quite the same kind of layout and set requirements, but effectively something in addition to that kind of bar there at the moment that we're sitting on, or around the readiness. So I think the readiness is almost fairly clear cut that a lot of that would probably be required, but noting that there are some differences for demand projects and obviously hydrogen projects being included in that. And just noting time, I'll just kind of quickly move on to here. So connection reform status, where we are at the moment, it's not over. I know a lot of focus is now on demand, but for generation storage, a lot of projects are still waiting for offers, and we are those that were protected, the kind of first phase of protected projects are all out. And we are now in a phase where anything else within phase one, either transmission or distribution connected, should be all available. All those re-offers should be out by mid-November. When we're talking about phase one, that's any project that had the date to connect before the end of 2030. And then phase two is before the end of 2035. And I mentioned earlier that there's a pause on new applications. If you're connecting to the distribution network, absolutely put an application in. But if you're connecting to, if you'll be transmission sort of scale, then it's not so straightforward. There is that pause, and the next ability to put an application in will become gated going forward. So it used to be you could put an application at any time for a transmission connection. Now it'll have to go through a gated process. And when is that gated process going to be? Well, it's a good question. I heard somebody say the other day on a demand-focused conversation around it being Q3. That was the aim of it being Q3 2026, but I don't think anybody expects it to be July this year. It's going to be a bit later, but officially it's still sometime in 2026. And this little diagram at the bottom is a bit of an extract from NESO, really just kind of drawing out the kind of pull and push of when the next window should be set. And the pull for doing it sooner being people requiring to put in mod apps, filling under supply, etc., and then push to do later. Predominantly being if you open a window up for new applications and you haven't actually done all the studies for the re-offers that you're getting out now, it becomes a very complicated situation. So you maybe have to complete this process before you can fully do all your analysis. Importantly, I would flag from a demand perspective and a hydrogen perspective is that a pull to do sooner doesn't include the need to unlock transmission connected demand. I think that might be on the next revision of that diagram, but it wasn't in the mindset of NESO at the time. So it's one of the reasons why we're trying to raise the awareness here and try and kind of bring, I suppose, those that will need connections along, because quite often, and it was quite far down your pegging order of lots of different priorities from a hydrogen or demand perspective, but actually this is one that probably does need more involvement in the industry, either directly through the likes of the HEA or with kind of actors in the industry such as ourselves. This is just a bit of a wheel of what offers have gone out, but I just wanted to more flag that from a demand perspective, transmission connected demand, a lot of those were not connecting because of when they were aiming to connect, or when their ability to connect was. They weren't connecting before in 2027, so that's why you've no demand shown there. So we would be expecting around about 99 gigawatts worth of demand to be in the NQ. So that kind of 125 has been reduced slightly by some projects not being able to be noted as ready, but anything, if you were demand, you automatically strategically aligned. So what we're seeing now is going forward is actually, even if you can meet the readiness criteria, there's maybe some additional criteria built on top to see, well, do you strategically align, and is there any other readiness criteria that's more related to demand? So looking forward to kind of demand considerations, so we've talked a lot about, I suppose, knowing that there is change in the industry, knowing that it's not as simple as popping an application in and getting your offer and then being able to kind of build out. But even putting that aside, there's still a lot of other things happening in the industry to try to allow demand to be a bit more, I suppose, a bit more aligned to generation storage, which is not at the moment. So if you're a final demand, like a standalone demand at transmission level, you'll have a different type of connection agreement. If you are looking to build out assets, if you're a generator, you can build out a 400 kV breaker. You can build out cable at 400 kV because that's allowed under a generation license. If you're demand, you won't have a generation license. You're not entitled to one. So how do you do that? Well, at the moment, you end up having to actually get the transmission owner would build out a lot more assets to you. But that becomes quite a different solution. And particularly if you're looking to try and co-locate with generation, for example, or share bays or kind of minimize the capex cost of your electricity connection, that becomes really quite complicated. Something we're doing a lot of work on at the moment. I have actually put a class exemption forward to try to kind of get look at solutions to that asset ownership challenge. But there are also design standards, etc., that also kind of fit in there as well that you really need to be quite careful about when even putting an application in, because whatever you ask for will have an implication on what you get in an offer. And particularly now, if you have to go through a gated process, if you put an application in and it's not quite right, and you get an offer out that you can't realistically accept or you certainly can't build out, then you might have lost your opportunity, because if others have put applications in at the same time, you apply in the next window thereafter, which could be 6 months, a year down the line, you're now further behind in the queue. So on that, I appreciate there's been a lot kind of we've gone through there, and I'm just looking at the kind of Q&A that's come through at the moment, which unfortunately isn't loading on mine. So I've only got one question, but if there are any other questions, then please do pop them up on the Q&A. So regarding electrolysis for hydrogen production and distribution, most properties in the developed world already have access to hydrogen compound water. Sort of quite a long one. Yeah, okay, so this is talking more about the water supply. Yeah, so I think generally when we're talking, so if we're talking generally about, because there's quite a bit of detail there, it's probably not easy for me to read within the remaining time, but in terms of, I suppose, what we are talking about here at the moment is very much any electricity connection that you might need. Of course, there are other alternatives where you don't need a grid connection, or you can, I suppose, maximize opportunities kind of off-grid, etc. What we are really highlighting is if you do need a grid connection, whether that's to fully supply your site or to access certain markets, etc. in the future, then we do see quite a few projects who don't need electricity access all the time, but they always come back to needing some sort of kind of grid interface. Otherwise, you're effectively sitting in a kind of islanded situation, which may absolutely work for some projects, but does have quite a different business case associated with it. Certainly that question, Steve, I'll read through in a bit more detail and can always come back to you more directly on that. Are there any other
Kyle,
questions?
yeah, I think there's one question from Alex Savides from Statcraft, who's asking, how do you think HEA application awards and delivery windows could be best aligned with the gated grid process under grid reform?
Yeah, very good question, Alex. And it's something that we've fed back on quite a few of the consultation responses as well. I think the challenge has been, and the response that we've had is, if you align with the HEA rounds, whether you're aligning with the application or you're aligning with the decision, it's probably realistically quite achievable. But the challenge is, if you do that with HEA, then you also would have to be doing that with CFD, with cap and floor, with CCUS, and before you know it, you end up having 5, 6, 7 different funding rounds that you're trying to coordinate with. And NESO's position has been, we can't coordinate with all of that, what we'll try and do is recognize that, okay, if there are certain needs, we'll maybe work with those funding bodies or those bodies that are putting those rounds together to try and ensure that, when you're putting in a higher application, for example, if it requires you to have a grid connection, but you've not been able to apply for one, then that's at least recognized rather than the current situation, which is quite mismatched. So my expectation is it probably unfortunately won't be fully aligned, but we could definitely do better as an industry to make sure that the requirements at least are linked.
That's a really helpful insight, Kyle. Thank you. And that's definitely something that within the HEA, as you say, kind of the piece on raising awareness of these policy points and how we can feed them into our policy shaping are important. So I'm sure the low carbon hydrogen production group can have that in mind. I think that is all the questions, and we are out of time. It's the 30 minutes short and snappy session of the Hydrogen Bytes, but I appreciate there's a lot of detail here for the attendees to process. So Kyle, I don't know what the best way for people to contact you if they have any further questions once we circulate these materials. But if you could pop some kind of either your email or a general email for people to reach out to you. I think we've got various comments coming through. Thank you for your presentation. So really thank you very much for bringing your expertise to the Hydrogen Bytes session today.
No problem at all. I'll just pop my email, well, the client's email address into the chat.
Amazing.
And certainly we can pick up, even if it's not, if it's just kind of queries or thoughts. Just, I suppose, a kind of side note, we do feed into quite a few other trade bodies which are very grid focused as well, and we feed into a lot of the working groups that Ofgem and DESNES are hosting. So there's definitely an opportunity to feed in thoughts and ideas through us as well. Great,
thank you very much, Kyle, for that offer as well. And have a lovely rest of your day, everyone. We'll see you on the next Hydrogen Bytes.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.